Great, that was noisy. Let's start it so folks can come inside. Hi, everyone. We'll get started in about a minute. We're just letting folks load on in and get their audios all connected like you do, and then we'll get started. Thanks for being here. All right, hi everyone, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jackie from Greenlight Bookstore and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Mia Charlene, presenting her new book, The Sustainability Myth, Environmental Gentrification and the Politics of Justice. She will be talking with Mia Charlene White, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thank you to Melissa, Mia, and the team at NYU Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're so grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of Zoom housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen, precisely where depends on what kind of device you are using. There are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a single speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. And if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, you can post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two dialoguing speech balloons, and we'll be pulling questions exclusively from the Q&A tonight to be answered later on in the program, so you can put them in as they come to you as Melissa is reading and Melissa and Mia are speaking. An important tonight's featured event, The Sustainability Myth, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations from 12 to 7 any day of the week, and you can purchase Melissa's book and many more on site, or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat. If you care about supporting the careers of authors like Melissa and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores like Greenlight, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Mia Charlene White. She's assistant professor of environmental studies at the New School in New York City, where she teaches courses on race, geography, and space-making practices in communities of color. Now residing and organizing in South Orange, New Jersey, Mia is proud to have roots in both Tarrytown, New York, and Queens, New York. She's a parent of two very energetic school-age kids, lives with disability, and identifies as a Black woman of African-American and Korean descent. Mia did her PhD in urban planning at MIT, her Master of International Affairs at Columbia, and her bachelor's degree in anthropology at SUNY Stony Brook. Mia has been recognized for trauma-informed teaching methods with a focus on social justice. She's currently working on her first book manuscript titled Fugitive Planning, a Blues Epistemology from the Undercommons. It's an ethnographic exploration of vernacular, planning resistance in brown and Black spaces. Mia has been featured in Harper's, Glamour, Alternet, HuffPost, Good Morning America, and North Jersey local media. She will be speaking this evening with our featured author, Mia Charlene. Melissa is the Hagedorn Professor of Urban Studies at Queens College and Associate Professor of Anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's the author of Polluted Promises, Environmental Racism and the Search for Justice in a Southern Town, and co-editor of the book Sustainability in a Global City. Her new book, The Sustainability Myth, is a cautionary, eye-opening tale taking a hard but ultimately hopeful look at environmental justice activism and the politics of sustainability. Checker uncovers the hidden costs and contradictions of sustainable policies in an era driven by real estate development. Melissa's going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Mia and with all of you. I'll put the buy link in the chat, and Melissa, please take it away. Thanks so much for joining us this evening, folks.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Mia and the folks at Greenlight Bookstore for doing this event. I really am really excited to be here, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm going to start with the first couple of pages of the introduction and the last couple of pages of the introduction. And I'm going to put up a slide here for your viewing pleasure, which will be the reason for which will be clear in a moment. In late 2012, exactly 2 weeks after Hurricane Sandy pummeled the Atlantic seaboard, some 150 weary and shaken Staten Island residents shuffled into the music hall at the Snug Harbor Cultural Center. Many had only just regained electricity. A mid-November draft chilled the auditorium. With its faded red velvet seats and chipped paint, the 120-year-old theater itself seemed to embody a down but not out mood. With so many people attending in the aftermath of a crisis, the meeting might have been about flood protection or emergency management. But that was not the case. Instead, it offered residents a chance to comment on a plan to build the world's largest Ferris wheel high atop Staten Island's northern shoreline. The New York wheel was the brainchild of Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who claimed that it would be an attraction unlike any other in New York City, even unlike any other on the planet. The wheel was set to rise 84 feet higher than the Singapore Flyer, which was currently the title holder for the world's largest Ferris wheel, and it would beckon riders 24 hours a day. I arrived at the wheel meeting just as it started and scanned the auditorium for Burl Thurman, who was saving me a seat. Catching my eye, Thurman's face lit up with one of her warm, contagious smiles, and she beckoned me over. Since 2005, Thurman had presided over the North Shore Waterfront Conservancy, or NSWC, a local environmental justice organization. She was known for peppering her frank comments with witticisms. I first met Thurman on a fateful morning in mid-March in 2009 when she pulled her gray Mercury Sable into the pickup lane at the St. George Ferry Terminal on Staten Island. I had contacted Thurman a few weeks earlier for an interview, and she offered to take me on a toxic tour of her neighborhood instead. As I settled into the passenger seat, she looked over and greeted me slyly. "Welcome to the North Shore. I like to call this place an industrial Girls Gone Wild." For over 3 hours, Thurman drove me along a 5-mile stretch of the Kilvan Col, a narrow tributary that divided the North Shore from Bayonne, New Jersey. Along the shoreline, she pointed to a dizzying array of industrial properties, 21 in all. These included a sanitation garage, an electric power plant, a waste transfer station, a sewer treatment plant, an industrial salt manufacturer, a salvage yard, several former factories and ship repair yards, and the site of an old warehouse that contained levels of uranium nearly 10 times higher than the acceptable limit. All of these sites sat within 70 feet of dense and economically and racially diverse residential neighborhoods, and most were within flood zones. I had seen plenty of examples of environmental injustice across the United States, but never had I witnessed the volume, density, and proximity of toxic sites and residential neighborhoods that I saw that day. So this is skipping over to the end of the introduction now. And we're fast forwarding to January 2017. In January 2017, I attended a meeting of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, along with representatives of from each of the city's environmental justice organizations. The Department of Environmental Conservation was revamping its environmental justice guidelines, and they wanted input from experts. I sat between Burl Thurman and staff from El Puente, the venerable environmental justice organization started by the late Luis Garden Acosta, a former member of the Young Lords. Nearly 20 years before, I had conducted research with El Puente when Williamsburg was still predominantly Latinx, although rapidly filling with 20-something hipsters. Within the next decade, Williamsburg transformed from gritty to grungy to an icon of gentrification. With some of the city's most exclusive restaurants, boutiques, and apartment buildings, it was hard to imagine that an organization like El Puente was still there. "Wow," I said to the El Puente staffers, "glad to see you guys here, and kind of surprising." One of the women replied, "Yeah, I know, everyone thinks we don't exist anymore, but there are still low-income Latinx families in South Williamsburg, and we still have environmental problems." Her words reminded me that gentrification Even the hyper-gentrification that Williamsburg has experienced is rarely a uniform process, and rarely does it displace every low-income family in a neighborhood. Back in 2009, Garden Acosta and I were talking about disparities between the beautifully restored Williamsburg waterfront and the highly polluted waters of the river it fronted. Radiac, a nuclear waste transfer facility, was still operational near the waterfront, and many toxic sites left over from Williamsburg's industrial past had been turned into the neighborhood's new multi-million-dollar apartment complexes. Babies, Garden Acosta exclaimed at the time. The gentrifiers are having babies. His concern was not just for El Puente's remaining constituents, but for the neighborhood's newcomers as well. Garden Acosta worried that the neighborhood's splendid waterfront, eco-friendly condos, and organic restaurants and stores lulled these new residents into thinking that its environmental problems had been rectified. The environmental justice activists in this book refuse the lull of sustainability's false promises. Their struggles to call out the contradictions of environmental gentrification and the fallacies of participatory politics lie at the heart of this book. Perhaps these struggles also lie at the heart of our collective future. Short-sighted and profit-driven sustainability policies and practices undermine the very goals of sustainability itself. As Beryl Thurman wrote in a furious email to her elected officials, quote, "We plod along as if we have all the time in the world for these problems to be resolved and come to a reasonable conclusion. And to be honest, we don't have a lot of time. We are on the same clock as developers, businesses, and Mother Nature. It's whoever gets here first," end quote. The sustainophrenic city is built upon its own undoing.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you tonight. I'm in awe of your ability to produce an academic book without it sounding overly academic. And I just absolutely love the variety of methodological approaches that you take in the book. Because for me as a writer and as a researcher myself, it's a model, I think, for how to do this work. So I'm just grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. I'm hoping we'll have an interesting and exciting conversation. So before I launch into, I nerded out a little bit. I read the book twice, and I have 10 questions, but we're not going to necessarily get to all the questions, and obviously we'll leave time for the Q&A. But before we kind of get into the juicy bits, I wanted to, in the spirit of bearing witness, as you so gracefully do really all throughout the book, I wanted to, as you do with regard to the activists and the advocates whose labor helped shape your inquiries, and because we both knew him, I wanted to invoke the name of a mutual friend and interlocutor who passed away last year, and that is Cecil Corbin Mark. So I just wanted to read just a few words in the event that there are others who have joined us who knew Cecil. And I'll just say a few words, and then I just offer a moment of silence for us to honor him together. Cecil, okay, and thank you. Cecil Corbin Mark was a leading environmental advocate and activist who organized communities to push for health protections and climate action. He died on Thursday, October 15, 2020, after suffering a stroke. He was only 51 years old. Cecil was a lifelong resident of Hamilton Heights, where his family had lived for nearly a century. Cecil graduated from Hunter College with a degree in political science, and later he earned a Master of Philosophy in International Relations from Oxford University in the UK, where he studied the political traditions of the African diaspora in the Americas. After that, he spent almost 3 decades working with and building WEAC, the West Harlem Environmental Action Center, where he rose to prominence as deputy director. We mourn his too early passing, but we also celebrate and bear witness to how he has been praised for his deep intelligence and humor, his role in the passage of various environmental protection laws, his wide-ranging knowledge of policy, and his kindness toward others in the environmental justice movement. Please join me in a moment of silence to honor Cecil. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know that Cecil can hear us, and I know that he is so pleased that we're having this conversation because we're doing work through our talk, through our discourse that absolutely celebrates so much of his life's achievements and his labor. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. He was really fundamental to my research when I first started it. Yeah.
I saw you all through many places. I saw you quoting and citing Cecil and Peggy Shepherd, and I really I felt very touched, and also I felt a lot of respect for your citational practice, and you know, I found myself circling a lot of things in the notes of your book. And so for those in the audience who think nobody, you know, nobody kind of dives in there, they do. That's not true. I'm definitely one of those. So to start us off, Melissa, could you set this up a little bit for our listeners? You know, I'm assuming some people have read it and some people haven't, or maybe most people have already bought it, but they haven't really finished it or haven't gotten as deeply into it as I expect they will be soon. So if you could set this up a little bit, what was the work in the Deep South? Of course, I know, but I'm setting this up, that you had been focused on immediately prior to writing this book, because I think that will help our listeners kind of get into your mind and your practice and approach a little bit. Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks. I had done my dissertation research, which turned into the basis for my first book in Augusta, Georgia. And I had gone down there to work with a community, a very small, almost entirely African-American community, right on it within Augusta, kind of on the edge of Augusta. And they were this community that had been started by in the 1940s, and they were allowed to purchase land in this particular area under Jim Crow. And a lot of them were former military vets, and they had saved up money to buy these small parcels of land and built their own houses. And then over the years, there were a couple factories there when they started, and then more came and sort of ended up surrounding them. They like to call themselves the whole of a toxic donut. And they had found that one of those factories had been contaminating the water and soil around them. So they had waged a fight to get some kind of either remediation or cleanup, or to be moved away from the dangers of the neighborhood. They had a lot of health problems in this neighborhood. And so I really went to look at, just to study their struggle and to see how it was really coming from a civil rights tradition.
Yes.
As opposed to more sort of mainstream environmental movements.
Yeah.
And so, and they were, it was a fantastic experience. I'm still in touch with them, and they were fighting really hard for their lives, and they really felt that because that they were Black and poor, that they were being ignored by the local government.
And so, readers and listeners will sort of see the thread of connection with your earlier work, as you were thinking in the previous book about how the experience of race and class informed the activists and advocates' understanding of their environment and how they understood environmental issues as ultimately civil rights issues. I see a kind of a nice bridge to what we're here to talk about today. So turning to your new book, which just came out last year, again, The Sustainability Myth, Environmental Gentrification and the Politics of Justice. In the opening paragraphs, which you just read of the introduction, you introduce us to your ethnographic style again, which I love. it's both sort of traditional ethnography for those who haven't read the book yet. It's also kind of an institutional ethnography, really kind of really thinking across space, across the New York landscape institutionally. And I especially I felt myself really responding to that. But you as you quoted to us earlier, you're a key interlocutor, Beryl Thurman, who's, as you write, leader of the North Shore Water Conservancy. You tell us that she had warned that federal, state, and local officials. She had warned federal, state, and local officials that climate change presented a triple whammy, right? The first was that flooding was continuous and worsening. That's the first whammy. The second is that the floods constituted a toxic soup made from the heavily contaminated Kilven coal, street runoffs, sewage overflow, etc., and so forth. Okay, that's the second whammy. And then the third, that locals did not necessarily have the resources to get out of harm's way, right? Because at least over 17% of residents living with incomes below the poverty line, et cetera, and so forth. So this 3-point warning, I felt was very organic, clearly true, represented a kind of epistemology that you don't need a PhD to employ. And it hit me hard because it could have been said by any number of activists that I myself have worked with. Particularly, I was thinking about in the South, and sort of that connection between you and I. Where are you from? So you've lived in New York for quite a while, but where are you from?
I'm not from the South. I mean, I'm from Maryland, which
You're from Maryland. Okay,
counts
right.
as the South, really.
Right. So both you and I, of course, in many ways, we're really all from the South, but you and I are not from the South, but, have a connection to New York, and then both were doing some work in the South. But for me, it was post-Katrina. And I was particularly thinking about a woman who had helped me understand and taught me so much about Turkey Creek and North Gulfport, Mississippi in a post-Katrina context. And she would say almost exactly what Miss Beryl said to you about those warnings, and that how they applied at various scales, at the federal, state, and local scale, with this sort of set of this sort of what she called a triple whammy. So from this, you develop a couple of key categories of analysis, okay, that tease out this tension between what you write. You write zones of environmental privilege and zones of environmental sacrifice. And you lay this out with a kind of topology of environmental gentrifications that connect to what Ms. Beryl shared with you. So I wanted to ask if you could, and so it's the green, the industrial, and the brown, right? So that's the topology, and I kind of like that you develop this typology, and it in some beautiful, important ways tracks what Ms. Beryl, right, has laid out as her epistemology, as she's driving you around and you're going to these meetings, et cetera, and so forth. So can you tell our listeners more about this topology and the significance of it for you as you then were kind of, I guess, coming up with this other term, sustainophrenia?
Yeah, sure. So environmental gentrification is a term that has been around for a while, at least 10 years, probably more. And in general, it's it means the linkage between environmental improvements and high-end redevelopment. And what I wanted to do is kind of break it down into these more specific forms that it takes, that I saw that it took during my research period. So the first one I refer to as green gentrification, which is the installation of parks, green space, greenways, waterfronts, esplanades, things like that, and the sort of ways in which those accompany or facilitate gentrification and high-end redevelopment. So I have a chapter where I really looked at that, the linkage between those, and that's kind of the most obvious one that I think a lot of people are familiar with.
Yeah.
Then what I call industrial gentrification is the, in New York City, we've seen over the past 10 years, a lot of these sort of new industrial spaces, new manufacturing spaces. Usually they're spaces for artisanal manufacturers or green tech, clean tech, like the Brooklyn Navy Yard, what's happening over in the Army Terminal and over in Sunset Park, Industry City. So what I noticed about those spaces is that they were often alongside or kind of in gentrifying neighborhoods. And so that to me is another type of environmental improvement, because they're kind of greening them or cleaning them up, making them into these small scale manufacturing spaces. So they're not so polluting, but they're still also tied to high-end redevelopment. They're almost like another neighborhood amenity, because you can live close to your pickle maker or your distillery or whatever.
Right.
So, and then the third kind of is what I call brown gentrification, which is the cleanup of brownfields or polluted sites. And I looked at the sort of incentive programs that allow developers to clean up those sites and repurpose them. And that also is associated with high-end redevelopment. So there are these different ways that these kind of things that are working towards greening New York City on these different levels are also all part of this rapid gentrification that we've been seeing.
Could you talk a little bit about the Dumbo example?
Sure. The Dumbo example. You mean like the cleanup of the park?
I'm sorry, the Navy Yards and sort of I'm sorry. The Navy Yards and sort of I circled it here. You were talking about how the Navy Yards, just kind of building on this framework that you've laid out, that the Navy Yards required, in order for Navy Yards to happen, it needed to be sort of situated in this community and between these communities that would see this sort of high end.
Right. Thanks. And if you look at the property values, I mean, first of all, like when the Navy Yard was about to, was sort of went from being kind of a gritty space to being a fancier space, or a more kind of hipstery space. And at the same time, they were building housing around it. So it really kind of generated new high-end housing along the perimeters. And then also the property values in the areas in both Dumbo and in Brooklyn Heights really skyrocketed at the same time. So it was kind of part of this larger rezoning and redevelopment package that was trying to attract young professionals to the area. And so it really was kind of billed as this amenity, because people were kind of, I think, coming there anyway to go to the studios and visit, the food sellers around there. So
I liked a lot of this book, but in particular, I liked, I wasn't really necessarily expecting the tech exploration. There are some pieces where you're doing that, where you're really forcing the reader to confront the relationship between high end, whatever it is, in your explorations, often sort of real estate development and luxury housing, et cetera, and so forth, but also tech and the relationship to tech. Would you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, and that's something that's really ongoing right now in the city, is that there's a big push to make New York City a kind of tech center, which I don't have any problem with that. That's great, and that's fine. The issue is that it's kind of part of this simultaneous push that we need more industrial jobs or more manufacturing jobs, more so-called blue collar jobs. So a lot of these kind of tech spaces are going into, it depends on the, but if they're actually manufacturing some of this tech, then they're going into these manufacturing zones.
Yep.
And it's being promoted as, look, we're retaining manufacturing jobs in New York City, but that's not exactly what's happening, because a lot of these are more high-tech jobs, and there may be some people who are doing unskilled or low-skilled work somewhere in there, but they're not necessarily getting paid as well as the people who are kind of the face of it. And it's not traditional manufacturing, so they're probably getting minimum wage. They're not necessarily getting benefits, so it's not the same as it's not at all like replacing manufacturing of old, job wise. I mean, we don't want that replaced in terms of the contaminants it emitted, but it would be nice if it was a little more inclusive.
Yeah. Well, I guess since we're talking about tech, I realized I read one of my questions out of order. So you don't it does feel like a in many ways a book about racial capitalism. In many ways, right? Because I teach on that and that set of theories, that theory approach, that framework. I aspire to teach in the tradition of Cedric Robinson, may you rest in peace. It is, I did keep feeling it all over your book. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to think with us a little bit about that. And for those who are listening, racial capitalism is the process of deriving or extracting value from the system of race or people's racial identity. That's just the shortest way and so because in when you're talking about the double bind, or you're talking about something green happening over here as predicated on this other thing happening over here, it does again very much sound like racial capitalism. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I mean, I bring that up in the beginning, and I didn't really use the term throughout the book, although it is very much a running theme. I mean, one reason perhaps is that I wanted to kind of put together racial exploitation, the exploitation of Black and Brown people, with the exploitation of the environment. And so to me, those things really go hand in hand. And so that you can't have economic growth without depleting natural resources. And so that growth comes at the expense of our natural resources. And similarly, I show that that growth also comes at the expense of human resources, specifically, on the backs of people of color, so that we can't live in a supposedly green city without causing environmental harms to people who, whether they're within New York City, in other states where they're getting our waste, or whether they're, in other countries where they're getting some of our waste, so there's that kind of, it's always a zero-sum game. So it's sort of, there's no win-win scenario. It's a win-lose. So there's always that extraction taking place, that extraction of some kind of resources, natural human resource or human resources, or that there's always like a exploitation process that's going on. And that, the things, they very much go together.
I teach on abolition a lot, and very much wrapped up in it as I'm writing. And so I wanted to, and obviously, abolition really wants us to think about decriminalization, right? Even anti-criminalization. Some people, though, might process what your work is about, your book and your ideas, and say, well, that's criminal, or it should be criminal. You know, the idea that you get to do this stuff in one place and call it green, but it's predicated on, redistributing or displacing harm into another space, community. You talk about the history of Seneca Village, which is close to my heart. The students and I go there, to the Upper West Side, and we do the walk, and we do, and the poetics of that. It's very somatic for many students in particular who are in New York City, to be confronted with the violence and the beauty, the contradictions, but the beauty sort of predicated on what is really a violent set of acts. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you think. Do you think that sustainability is impossible? Do you think it is a Ponzi scheme? Do you think it is a lie? I mean, we know when and where the term, gained popularity in the 90s and in the United Nations context. So, sort of these large, multinational sort of, organizing spaces, if you will. And we know what organizers want sustainability to mean. We know what Cecil, in fact, I have a quote. I'm not sure if it's actually from Cecil, but here, it's from a 2008 article for Reimagine magazine, and you excerpt it here, of course, on page 43. Sustainable development is often presented as a traditional environmental issue, but the forces that led to its emergence are not the traditional greens. Any credible analysis of sustainable development will reveal that it was social justice movements that propelled the greens into thinking in terms of equity and justice for present and future generations. So when I look at something like this, and then I think about abolition, when I see the word justice, I am thinking about harm, and I am thinking about oppression that's predictable and systematic. And so I am grappling with the need to, pivot to a phrase like sustainability that can motivate millions of people, while simultaneously recognizing that the phrase, as you have excavated all throughout this book, enables so much harm. And I guess I'm grappling with that. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it's such a good question. I think that, there will be no way to achieve sustainability if racial justice and social justice and equity are not part of it. So, I mean, it's just, the term becomes meaningless otherwise, or it's not what it says it is. So, to me, they absolutely have to go hand in hand. That could mean like reclaiming that term and making, making it more closer to its original intent, and which was supposed to include economic, social, and ecological sustainability, or whether, we have to move to some other term, because this one has gotten co-opted and watered down. Whether it's possible at all, I mean, I really hope so. I like to keep hope that we can figure this out. I mean, again, two enormous things that are so commingled that, in my mind, they, we can't separate them. They have to be addressed, both addressed. And I don't know the best way to go about doing that, but if we're developing new awareness about racial justice, which I hope that we are, then that will hopefully lead us on a path. I don't know what to say. I don't have all these answers.
Yeah, no. I appreciate your candor, and I want to kind of in that same vein. I didn't somehow, for some reason, write what page this was, but in the book you suggest that struggle lay at the heart of our collective future. Struggle, and that the displacing of anxieties about climate change from their proper object to support green development is the problem. And so in that formulation, the displacing of anxieties about climate change from their proper object. What is the proper object, would you say, in that sentence?
I mean, I think the proper object would be policies, a lot of policies that enable this, enable carbon emissions, that are still privileging oil and gas companies, that are not, that are at the most doing sort of these band-aid solutions, but not really taking on the problem of climate change, or not, and
Yeah.
carbon reductions in a meaningful way. And I think that, it's very easy, especially with something as complicated as climate change, to think that if they kind of call something green, you want to believe that it's green. You want to believe, like, okay, good, like our mayor or our governor, whoever is taking care of this problem, and like that's the way to go.
Mhm.
And it sounds good, but so I really think it's about really kind of looking a little more deeply and realizing that this is going to be a struggle. So if it sounds like a win-win, again,
Oh yeah.
maybe it's not really a great solution, because it's
Yeah.
something that we're all going to have to give up something and sacrifice, and it's not just about plugging your new car into
Right.
a socket.
Right. I love your sort of how you confront this idea of the win-win. I really liked that. So to understand sustainability and real estate development, and how that dynamic has affected the lives of grassroots environmental justice activists and those living in their communities, you use an ethnographic method. What do you find most challenging about this method? Because there's the process and then there's the content. I really want to also explore process with you, because I very much am devoted to ethnography myself. And so I want to give an opportunity for those who are here to listen with you about what you love most about it, but also maybe what you find challenging about it as a method, just so that we don't just sound like we're just perennial cheerleaders of a particular method. And maybe even what advice you might have to people who are exploring ethnography, in the context of qualitative methods.
Yeah, well, okay, that's a big question, but I do, I mean, there's so many great things about, ethnography, for those who don't know, is participant observation. So you're really kind of not just observing what people do, but you're participating with them. So in my case, I study activists. So I participate with them, I join in their struggles. And, that's mostly really so meaningful to me. And so it feels like an honor to work with these people who day in and day out are struggling to make a better world. And I make some really close friends
Yeah.
who I'm still friends with. I mean, you really just can get involved in people's lives, and it enriches my life to kind of have those, have those friendships. And I don't feel like I'm just doing kind of academic research for the sake of academic research. It feels like it has a very kind of concrete grounding to it, where I'm really kind of helping. I mean, when I was in Georgia, I did things like hand out flyers, just
Yeah.
write some grants, things that really kind of helped propel the organization forward. So,
As like a volunteer, in the participatory kind of method, you got in there and you were working and laboring alongside.
yeah, right, exactly. And I did, a lot of that for in Staten, mostly with people in Staten Island. I did volunteer a little bit with We Act as well, just kind of
Yeah.
helping out with things. And so that, feels again like you're not just sort of some removed academic who doesn't study real world problems. The hard part is that these are really big problems, and they're affecting these people who I come to know and love. every day, and their lives are, it's not, they're sick, and
Yes.
it's, I lose, people, I've lost a lot of people from Georgia have died that I knew, and it's very real, and it's heartbreaking.
Thank you for using the word love. That is also something that I'm working through in my writing. I think about that word when I think about incredible people like Cecil who have gone too soon. And well, that is why, I offered that moment of silence. And this kind of leads me to my last question, and then I'll pivot to our audience questions. You write about democratic action and participatory politics, and you describe the ways in which a seat at the proverbial table, in other words, participatory politics, can often rechannel, as you say, and drain activists' time and energy. Could we go here and explore this a little bit in the context of the intimacies that you just shared? And obviously it certainly can't be too far removed from our friend Cecil's passing. So if you could explore that a little bit more.
Yes. And so that was part of what I found as I was doing all this work on sustainability and how the city was kind of rolling out these sustainability initiatives and what impacts they were having on people's everyday lives. And then working with the people who were kind of trying to advocate for environmental justice. And a lot of that was just trying to help sort of make sure that these policies had a positive impact on their neighborhoods. And that involved, today there are just more and more of these opportunities for public participation. It's a big buzzword.
Yeah.
And, there's so many visioning sessions and testimony, and public hearings, and there's a zillion opportunities where you can have your voice heard, supposedly. And so most of my work would just, involve some going to strategy session or, little meetings, small meetings with the groups I was working with. But most of it was just going to these events constantly, and these, asking to be on these part of these visioning sessions, or, there were so many things all the time, planning things, especially. And it was exhausting. And all the time that people spent going to public hearings and testifying and going to this public meeting and that, and really feeling pressured to do it, because if they didn't, then their community wasn't going to be represented at that meeting. And then, the powers that be would say, oh, well, nobody showed up from your neighborhood, so we figured you didn't care. But
yeah.
But they didn't have time to, do the actual organizing, because these things were kind of side or tangential to their missions a lot of the time. Or they were kind of like things that, so the city would come out with like a glossy new plan and say, oh, look, we came out with this plan and we had all this public buy-in, but it didn't have anything really to do with what the organization's goals were. And so it just kind of sidelined them and sidetracked them, and they, they just got jaded and exhausted and tired. I mean, Cecil being an exception with just like boundless energy and yeah, I mean, incredible person.
Such an incredible. We were in South Africa together, the World Congress on Sustainable Development.
Oh wow!
And then we were also at WCAR, the World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and the whole long list. And that's actually where I met him, because he was part of the EJ delegation. He was with BEACT, and at the time I was actually a junior program officer at the Ford Foundation.
Oh wow! Yeah.
I was working with Vernice Miller Travis. She was the senior program officer, and we worked on, well, she led the environmental justice portfolio. Now it's all reorganized, and it's not organized like that. But at the time, it was a $4 million portfolio focused solely on supporting environmental justice activism in the United States. And Vernice was a trailblazer, and as was Peggy Shepard, who was a key interlocutor of hers, and so forth. And so therefore I studied these women, and I studied Cecil's work, I mean, essentially, right? Because that WEACT being such a key organization. But I wanted to read you this quote, and perhaps you know it, from Toni Morrison, who says the function, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. And you actually write about that on page 157 or 156 and 157. You talk about this dynamic of reduced autonomy, whereby nonprofits who are engaged in leading this work and fighting for this work, right, fighting for justice, they find themselves less and less, I'm quoted, I'm reading directly here, less and less free to execute their long-term goals and missions. This dynamic, has, and you paraphrase, has the following consequences. Number one is from page 157 for folks following along. The state will force voluntary groups to plan reactively in response to new state policies and practices rather than proactively. Number two, contracts and grants, that's speaking to my old philanthropy world, will increasingly come with requirements for stringent, rigid, and quantitatively oriented approaches, not ethnographic approaches, to planning, evaluation, and monitoring. Number three, those organizations unable to meet the expanding demands will become marginalized and may not be able to secure funding to do their work. And then you say, number four, group activities may become aligned to funding needs and expectations for types of services to be delivered. And I thought that was, again, that so deeply tracks with what I have learned from the people that that I think we both seek to serve.
Yeah, I just want to say I was paraphrasing that. That was not my. That's
yeah, that you were paraphrasing.
Yeah, Jennifer Wolch.
Jennifer Wolch. Yes, sorry.
Yeah. So
yes.
I don't want to take
Wolch, right? Wolch forecasts. Yeah, you were.
What's amazing is that she wrote that, and I can't remember. She wrote that like I think it was like 15 years ago or something, predicting kind of where we are now with this.
Yeah.
The ways that these nonprofits, the hoops that they have to jump through to get their funding and to maintain their funding, and always having to kind of do these assessments and evaluations in a very quantitative way. Like we serve this many people, and there's all of, I don't know how many people here are familiar with that world, but they're always reporting in and counting numbers, counting heads, and it's a little bit ridiculous a lot of the time, but it takes up a lot of time.
Yeah, she wrote that in 1990. But just like, Toni Morrison wrote that, even said that quote even earlier, right? I mean, all that work, justifying the quantification, justifying one's humanity and dignity and presence, is in fact the very serious function of racism.
And it's hard not to feel like it's deliberate some ways, like that kind of distraction. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, thank you. Okay, so let's turn to some questions from the audience here. I see Laura Rossi is asking, what can individuals do to make changes happen? One or two suggestions anyone can take on anywhere, whether they are in the city or suburbs.
Okay, well, I would say find out, environmental justice is a widespread issue, and it's everywhere across this country. There's no really part of the country that I know of that it doesn't have, where if you go and look at the industrial neighborhoods, almost any city in the country, you'll see that they are also nestled within sometimes low income, but usually low income and people of color neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So find out where they are and find out if there are local groups that are organizing and help those, see if you can pitch in and do something to help those struggles. I mean, I would say that would be my number one thing, is to find out what's happening close to you in your own backyard, so to speak, and get involved in it. go from there.
Thank you. That is, I think, very important advice. Get involved, study the world, the community, the neighborhood around you, and seek to understand how the most vulnerable around you, how they're making things happen. You know, that's my little offering in the spirit of the late Clyde Woods and his wonderful work on blues epistemology, studying how the most vulnerable understand the world around them. And you can learn a lot doing that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of, sort of what I learned as an ethnographer and an activist is, I say, join the struggle.
Yeah.
Don't go in and say, I know what you need to do, but, just see what they're doing and then see if you can help.
Awesome. And then Meg Roberts here is asking, what types of actions do you suggest individuals take to support and further EJ?
Yeah, so I think that's a related question. I think that would be also my solution. And, again, to see what's happening very locally. And I think that to me is also, it's, it's also good to recycle and compost and do all those things. But this, I think, would be very meaningful and would probably have more, more of your individual actions would probably have more of an impact if you kind of really get out there and try to work with local struggles. And sometimes they may not necessarily be called an environmental justice organization, but if you look and see what's happening in a vulnerable community, again, usually there's industries and polluting entities around them, and they're just sort of started a community center, or they're doing a food delivery program. It could be a lot of different things, but there's a justice element to it, and it's usually tied to the environmental justice in some way. It's just sometimes it's not always considered, it's not, that title is not always on it.
And the pressures, the intersecting pressures that you lay out in the book, illustrate how, in fact, we need to be really thinking about environmental justice and sustainability, if we are to, as interdisciplinarily as possible. Right. So like the suggestion that folks go out and find ways to study and serve vulnerable communities in their, proximate midst. Right. It's almost sort of like, climate jobs policy, is a housing jobs policy. Environmental justice policy is a housing jobs, is a housing for all, is clean water, is a, open access to energy, open access to bandwidth, to the internet. Like these are these intersecting issues, I think. And the more that we don't see them as disaggregated, the more we can contribute and serve.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and it's all so closely imbricated. And I just want to say, I know we'll probably wrap up soon, but this is a really important point because, when you live in a community that's overburdened by pollution, that affects, for parents, let's say, if it's likely your kids will develop asthma. I mean, that's one thing that's very common. And then, you may not have enough money to pay for inhalers or the kind of medications that they need, which means you're staying home from work to take care of them when they have asthma attacks, which means that they're missing school. So their education is affected. And then that affects them later in life in terms of, it's such a kind of cascading effect. And these things are so caught up with each other. And we know also with COVID that neighborhoods where there was, that suffered from small particle pollution, a lot of diesel trucks going through things, the mortality rates were much higher during COVID. So it's kind of, it can start small, but it quickly just the problems become very layered.
Right. And you really start to see that we have to change everything.
Yes.
These vulnerabilities here absolutely impact the vulnerabilities here. And we're such complicated social creatures, our vulnerabilities become very much intersecting and intertwined. And so thank you so much. I think we're at 8:30. I think Greenlight wants to come back in and make a final message and reminder about the book. Melissa, thank you so much for this
Thank
conversation.
you.
I can't wait to meet you and have this signed, actually, for real. So
Thank you.
I hope it's in the near future. Thank you.
This has been such an incredible and informative discussion. Mia and Melissa, both thank you so, so much. It's really been an honor to host the conversation and make space for a discussion around how interdisciplinary, intersectional, all of these interweaving realities of environmental justice. So thank you truly. The bio link is in the chat. You can find Melissa's book at Greenlight. We're always honored to host this kind of conversations, particularly with folks from CUNY and New York local folks who are looking at these issues in our own communities. Thank you both for your time, and we'll see you next time you join us for an event. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night.